Whether you've been a professional salesperson for 30 years or you just started your first sales job yesterday, the number one thing that will ultimately determine your success day in and day out is right between your ears. It's your mindset. We've all experienced at one time or another someone trying to sell us something we didn't see the need for nor want at that moment. It's the pushy, over-aggressive, self-focused salesperson that perpetuates the stereotype. The reality is, sales is a noble profession. In fact, without it, the economy would grind to a screeching halt. Most salespeople wake up every day with fear. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of not hitting quota, etc. It's that very fear that drives us inward in our focus, and that mindset causes the unintended consequence of distrust and disconnect with our customers. The number one job of any sales profession is ultimately to solve the customer's problem. The issue, however, is that many of us have been trained over the course of our sales career on how to ask leading questions, look for opportunities to present the facts, features, and benefits of our solutions before we've earned the right or the trust of the customer. The most successful salespeople are individuals who have a mindset of what I call the 3 S's. The first S is adopting a servant's mindset. What can you do to better understand the customer and their perspective? How can you look through their lens to gain a better view of their world? It may be cliched, but how can you attempt to metaphorically walk a mile in their shoes? The more you do this, the more empathetic you will become, and this servant mentality will come across to the customer loud and clear. Now, once you've done your best to view the world through your customer's lens, you arrive at the second S, which is to share your experience and knowledge, as well as the experience and knowledge of other customers who've had similar problems. Now, once you've served and shared effectively, you've earned the right to help the customer with the third S, and that's solve their problem. The order matters significantly. This process of serving, sharing, and then solving builds authentic trust up front and leads the customer to a place where they genuinely want your help to solve their problem because they trust you. Assuming you now have the appropriate solution to help them, you've made a new customer and likely a new friend in the process. So here's a few key mindset evaluation questions to ask yourself. Do you genuinely care about other people's problems and find that you're typically empathetic towards them? Do you often share great ideas with others around great experiences that you had? Maybe it was a great movie, a new restaurant, etc. When others share their problems with you, do you instinctively think of and potentially offer solutions to help them? If you said yes, then you already have the right mindset to be a serving, sharing, solving salesperson. It's actually a lot more natural than you thought, huh? In fact, I believe that everyone in the world is a salesperson. The question is, do you come across in a way that perpetuates the stereotypical salesperson, or are you someone who genuinely likes to connect by following the 3 S's approach? When you approach your role from the serve, share, and solve mindset, you'll not only see your sales skyrocket, you'll find that your own job satisfaction elevates right along with your numbers. We know that people buy from people they trust. They trust people they like, and they like people they connect with. When a salesperson launches into their presentation mode too early, it not only bypasses the customer's mental trust process, it actually sends the brain into a place of skepticism and judgment. At the simplest of levels, here's the filter and the stages the buying brain works through: safety, connection, trust, understanding, opportunity, and credibility. To positively impact your customer, you must follow the path of connection to credibility. Here's how you can evaluate this process. Can you quickly and genuinely create trust by connecting with your customer through mutual beliefs? This helps drop their defense mechanisms and gets you through the first 3 stages: safety, connection, and trust. Can you reinforce that trust through your understanding and empathy of their situation and/or issues? Because this accomplishes stage 4, understanding. Can you clearly show them a path forward that results in their success? In other words, stage 5, opportunity, options available to them. Can you demonstrate proof that you and your company have the ability to actually solve their problem? This is stage 6, credibility. To summarize, it's about creating an environment of safety and trust through connection, then demonstrating a clear understanding of their issues, being able to clearly and simply articulate the opportunities available, and then demonstrating your credibility to help them solve the problem. Following this order is imperative as it allows your customer's brain to work through its normal cascade of processing and sets you up for optimal success.
時代向前，但大家嘅生活呢？
生活同健康倒退，
仲可以點做？
自保，自己救自己。
步態引領。
Instead of thinking about how many possible people could buy your product if all the stars aligned appropriately, I want you to start thinking about who in the marketplace is your product or service most likely to help quickly and effectively solve a problem, and then work backwards from there. So what is an ideal customer anyway? An ideal customer could be described as a customer who values your product or service, a customer whom you can make a profit from. Sorry folks, but this is a business. You got to make money or you won't be in business very long. A customer who'd be willing to refer you to other potential customers. Start with the smallest market possible. If you identify a very focused group of potential customers that have the highest likely degree of success with your product or service, you will gain credibility faster and be able to expand your customer base. I'd like you to think of your ideal customer through the ready, willing, and able framework. Let's take a look at them one at a time. First, are they ready? Issue. Do they have a problem that they need solved? Awareness. Do they know they have a problem? Motivation. Do they have a sense of urgency to solve their problem? Next up, are they willing? And this starts with timing. Are they ready to solve the problem today? Are they searching? Are they currently looking for solutions to solve their problem? And finally, are they able? The first category here is money. Do they have the budget to solve the problem? Next is authority. Do they have permission or approval or the decision-making authority to actually solve the problem? Now, how do we find these customers that are ready, willing, and able? Start by creating ideal customer personas or profiles. Customer personas include the following information. What's the ideal industry your best potential customer is in? The ideal title or experience that they have? What's the ideal buying cycle for your product? Meaning, is the customer ready, willing, and able to purchase your product when you need them to? And then the ideal location, meaning your product or solution is geographically aligned to where your best customer is also located. One of the easiest ways to get started with customer personas is to build them around your best current customers. If you've got a handful of great customers today who love and appreciate you and your product, then you're going to want to clone them. By building your personas around them, you create the exact profile for your next best new customer. Using these customer personas and the ready, willing, and able filter, you should be able to quickly narrow your pool of prospective buyers and qualify them much more efficiently. If you don't have this type of information readily available, talk to the person responsible for marketing at your company. They should be able to provide you these types of profiles. If you're a small business and you are both the sales and marketing departments, you basically have two choices. First, you can do the research yourself with the help of Google, LinkedIn, and others, or you can hire a market research company to help you build these target profiles based on your input and their expertise. Remember, the key is to find the narrowest group of customers with whom you can develop a quick and effective partnership by helping them solve their urgent problem, and you can expand from there. The key is to understand the customer's issues through their lens, not yours. The only way to do this is to ask experiential questions that allow the customer to really dig deep into their issues. Now let me introduce you to the easiest yet most powerful framework under the sun that will help you navigate this crucial sales success area. It's called the 4 I's. The first I is to uncover the issue. If there's more than one issue, it's very important to help the customer prioritize them. That way you can address the most urgent issues. The second I to identify is the impact the issue is having on the customer. This is where you will quantify the problem. If you fail to quantify the problem, then the customer won't have a relative comparison to value when you reveal the price of your solution. The third I is invasiveness. This is really a subset of impact, but reaches across the customer's organization and looks for the broader impact the issue may have. For example, if I can't improve my new business acquisition, then I can't hire more people, or worse yet, I may have to lay people off. Invasiveness can be any larger impact on the business that results in not solving this particular problem. The final I is iceberg. This is the giant barrier that has prevented the customer from solving the problem prior to your meeting. Generally speaking, icebergs tend to be knowledge, time, and/or budget or money. By addressing this area, you will reveal any potential objections the customer may have as to what will prevent them from moving forward with your solution. We've talked in great deal at this point about how customers make a purchase to solve a problem. That problem can be intrinsic or extrinsic, but either way, when we make a purchase, we feel like we are filling a need. Regardless of what we are buying, there are particular triggers or motivators that push us over the edge from window shopper to new customer. These motivators are key to understand, as each of your potential new customers will have one or more that will need to be met in order to secure, well, your order. These are in no particular order, as each buyer will be different. The first motivator we will discuss is price. How much something costs can be, and in many cases is, a large motivator in a buyer's decision. As with all purchases, I can use this to justify why I don't purchase or why I do purchase. The next motivator that tends to go along with price but is much deeper is value. People who are motivated by value are weighing the benefit of your product or service compared to the price that you're asking. The higher the perceived value, the more I'm willing to pay. Next up, we have quality. This motivator tends to go hand in glove with value. The difference between the two is where value is a perception of benefit versus price, quality is strictly the perception of caliber of the product or service. The fourth motivator is self-preservation. This scenario is when I feel that I must make a purchase in order to secure a promotion, prevent a demotion, or simply in more practical terms, protect my family or myself. This motivator is driven primarily by fear and is a highly emotional motivator. In a business-to-business sales setting, it's very difficult to uncover this motivator. Finally, the last motivator we will cover is social pressure. Many people buy products today based on who they know personally has recently bought the same product. This motivator derives from the groupthink mentality and the subconscious feeling of the need to fit in or belong, to not miss out. Many products today have gained mass market appeal simply by leveraging the motivation of social pressure. Why do you have the cell phone you have? What about the car you drive? How about the neighborhood you live in? Many subconscious factors go into the social pressure motivator, but it can be a strong ally in your sales approach if your product or service has the type of mass market reputation that creates a buzz in the mind of your prospective customer. These are the primary motivators of why customers buy. Once they know they have a problem and have decided to attempt to solve it, one or more of these motivators will help them pull the trigger. Your goal is to determine through your research and conversation which motivator is having the largest impact on their decision. Can you think of something that you've recently changed? Satellite provider, cell phone carrier, insurance? Change is hard for the vast majority of human beings, isn't it? Getting your customer to change is equally as hard. Let's talk about the change process and then go a little deeper into the barriers that prevent us from changing. In order to change, in particular from a consumer standpoint, we go through what I call the purchase change equation. Awareness plus motivation plus ability equals change. Step one is, does your customer have the awareness that they need to change or even that other options are available? The next step, step two, is how motivated are they to make the change? Is there enough pain, etc.? Change seldom occurs until the pain of staying the same exceeds the pain of change. Let that one sink in. Step three, how easily can they implement the change? If you have a great product or service but your lead times are 6 months out, you've made it much more difficult for me to change to your product. Even though the right level of awareness combined with the right level of motivation and the ease or ability to implement leads to the greatest likelihood of change, there are still several unconscious barriers that we all have to accepting change. The first is anxiety. When faced with a change, human beings tend to get really anxious. They do this due to the fact that they have the subconscious feeling that they are going to take a risk and don't know what the outcome will be. So what's the solution? Ensure there's trust in the relationship first, and then be mindful to continually speak to what the customer can expect from your partnership. Remove the unexpected and unknown, and you'll remove the anxiety barrier. The next barrier is the feeling of isolation. When faced with a change, humans tend to draw inward and feel isolated. We don't do this consciously. It's at a subconscious level. It stems from our internal fight or flight mechanism and that we need to hunker down and get through this change. So what's the solution? Ensure the customer understands how many other customers have been in their exact shoes and the results they have experienced by working with you. In addition, provide them with direct access to a couple of really satisfied customers who will walk them through their positive experience. Do this successfully, and they will move from a feeling of isolation to an excitement of being part of something that's already successful. The next barrier is the feeling of potential loss. Because humans primarily view change as bad, especially change that we didn't choose ourselves, we tend to look at the change cup as half empty rather than half full. As a result, we start looking for things we will lose or have to give up to make the change. It's part of our self-preservation mechanism buried deep within our subconscious. So what's the solution to this? Make sure you're using positive language that continually highlights what the customer will gain by making the change. The next barrier customers face is we can only take so much change at one time. I think this one is pretty self-explanatory. I once knew a person who moved twice, switched jobs, got divorced, and lost their father all in the same year. Overwhelming to say the least. Our brains are wired to handle only so many changes at once. If you try to sell more than one solution at a time to your customer, they may start to feel overwhelmed and not end up buying anything. What's the solution to this? Focus the customer at one incremental change at a time. Baby steps is the key. The next barrier is when the pressure to change is off, we tend to revert back to our old way. So referring back to the change equation, if my awareness is high but my motivation really isn't, then the minute you walk out of my door, no matter how excited you made me feel about your product, I will likely go right back to doing business the same way as before you came. What's the solution? Make sure you spend enough time really diving into the customer's issues and spend as much time as necessary quantifying those issues. That will drive up the motivation and urgency and the likelihood that they will make the change then and there. So in summary, it's really about your ability to help navigate your customer through the awareness plus motivation plus ability equation, all while keeping in mind the 5 subconscious potential barriers to change. Do so effectively, and you will ensure the sale and create trust and loyalty in the process.
Dropshipping is dead, and let me actually explain why.
That delivers the solution. Let's look at the formal definition of a product versus a solution. A product, simply defined, is an article or substance that's manufactured or refined for sale. Make sense, right? A solution is defined as a means of solving a problem or dealing with a difficult situation. See, the product may be the means, but the solution is most certainly the end. People buy solutions, not products. Now, I'm not sure about you, but where most salespeople run off the rails is that they try to sell products instead of solutions. They communicate the facts and the features and the figures and the opinions around the physical characteristics of their products rather than the process of arriving at a positive solution for the customer. So here's what I want you to do. Take a moment and make a list of all the solutions your product or service solves. Next, I want you to think about how you can ask better questions to get your customers focused on the solution to their problem first, and then use your product to solve it. What is it that distinguishes you from me? You may have black hair where I have blonde. You might be 5'9" where I'm over 6 feet tall. You may have long hair where mine is short. You get the point. It's our features that are the obvious initial characteristics that allow us to tell one person from the next. In certain circumstances, the benefits of those features may allow for one person to have an advantage over another. Now, when it comes to your product or service, it's critical to understand all your features, but it's the benefit of the feature that the customer needs to see as critical to solving their problem, and as importantly, the advantage your solution creates compared to other options that they have available to solve their problem. Many salespeople are wonderful at spouting the facts and data to describe all the wonderful features of their product or service, but great salespeople, they know all the details of their customer's problem they are solving and can relate the benefit of the features of their product, plus the resulting feeling the customer gets having used your solution to solve it. They do this while at the same time creating differentiating space from their competition by ensuring the advantage they possess over the competitor comes through loud and clear. Here's the application. If you haven't already done so in previous lessons, I'd like for you to make a list of the top 5 problems that your customers tend to have. Make them problems that your product or service can solve. Next, I want you to list out the top 5 to 10 features your product possesses. Next after that, next to each feature, I'd like you to list the benefit that that feature has to your customer in a way or manner in which it helps solve or leads to solving the problem. Finally, next to that, list the advantage that feature and benefit has over alternative or competitive solutions your customer might be considering. If you can successfully do this across the board, it will be extremely easy for your customer to see you as the obvious choice for their solution. Now, if you find that you come out on the losing side of each feature benefit advantage exercise, you might want to find a new product or service to market. We want proof. The need for proof that a product or service actually does what it says it does is rooted deep in our brain's subconscious mechanisms that drive self-preservation. We don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to get fooled. That will cause pain, and we like to avoid pain. Proof that a product or solution works helps us minimize that risk. And when it comes to the proof of your solution, there are 5 basic proof sources that you can pull from. The first proof source is that of the expert. Depending on the sophistication of your product or solution, an expert can really elevate the credibility of your solution in the eyes of your potential customers. There are experts in every field, so it's not a stretch to think that any given solution could use this source. The more technical the solution, the more appropriate the need for an expert proof source. A good example of this would be a doctor helping promote a new drug or supplement. The next proof source is that of a celebrity. Celebrity endorsements are quite powerful, particularly in the direct-to-consumer space. In the business-to-business space, celebrity proof sources are much less common. Next up, we have the user proof source. Regardless of the product or service, when you can demonstrate credibility through the eyes of the end user, you generate significant momentum and influence on new customers. Every website on the planet uses testimonials and reviews now to pitch their products. Using case studies and third-party reference stories in the business-to-business space is quite common and can be very effective if done properly. The fourth proof source at our disposal is the wisdom of the crowd. This proof source is like the user proof source, but supercharged. Rather than a specific user experience, wisdom of the crowd taps into our deep desire to be a part of something big, as well as our fear of missing out. This proof source uses the mass effect to influence. You know, if billions of people have eaten at McDonald's, then it must be good. If 30,000 people have joined a service, it must work. Volume of customers does equate to credibility in our subconscious minds. Finally, we have the wisdom of peers proof source. This technique leverages the known referral source. If you can generate a reference that the new customer is familiar with, you increase the influence factor tenfold. Now, if you're someone I trust and you refer me to someone who has a product or service that I need, I automatically transfer a portion of that trust onto you. This proof source is the most powerful as it comes from someone the potential new customer knows and trusts personally. One of these proof sources is powerful, but if you combine 2 or more, you can really differentiate yourself from your competition. Think of the various proof sources you have for your product or service. Create a list of ideas that fall into 1 or more of the previous categories. Now I want you to create a strategy to create and communicate these proof sources to your potential customer base. Keep these strategies in mind, and you'll have 1 more powerful tool in your sales toolbox. Customers want to know 3 things once they've decided to buy from you. First, that the solution will deliver what you promised, that it'll actually solve the problem. Second, that you can implement it effectively and on the agreed upon time frame. And finally, third, that there's continuity of customer service throughout the relationship. These expectations may sound like complete common sense, but you'd be surprised how many businesses don't operate with high marks in all 3 areas. Let me give you some ideas that will help you more effectively implement your solution. First, create a system by which someone on the sales team is the quarterback of the account. They are the single point of contact throughout the relationship. They should know everything that's happening and get regular reports from delivery on how things are going. They should also have regular check-in meetings with the customer throughout the implementation to ensure satisfaction. If your business has salespeople that are simply hunters and then pass it off, you might think about a team approach by which an account manager is with the salesperson every step of the way. The second thing you can do is to cross-train your delivery team on both customer service and sales. Then you can cross-train your sales team on delivery and customer service, and finally cross-train your customer service team on sales and delivery. This will create a team environment and break down the silo mentality that I mentioned earlier. Finally, have a system of customer satisfaction meetings and surveys that happen on a regular basis. I would recommend monthly, but quarterly at the least. The customer may not want to do these, especially if things appear to be going well, but you should bake this into the proposal from the beginning. See, many times a decision maker isn't aware that a potential problem exists until it's too late. Then you have to try to involve as many hands-on people at the customer side as possible to resolve it. If you have a commodity or retail product, your focus should be on customer service, as you likely don't have a delivery team per se. But for all of us that work in the business-to-business space, these strategies are critical to seamless implementation and will set you up for future sales within the same account and true customer loyalty for life. Familiarity is actually a stress reducer. Our anxiety in general is lower when we know what's coming next and what to generally expect. If you really stop to think about it, we have these routines across nearly all aspects of our personal life, from how we shower and get dressed to how we prepare dinner to the homework and evening routine we have with our kids. We have these routines for a very specific reason. We have found that over time, if we do certain things or certain behaviors in a certain order, we tend to get consistent and predictable results. The actual definition of process is a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. Makes intuitive sense, right? However, similar to the previous lesson where we discussed our tendency to resist change, we like routine and process that we create ourselves, but tend to resist the routines or processes that we perceive someone else is making us do. Humans are control freaks. Processes are typically no different. The first reason is that it helps create a consistent voice to the customer base. Too many lone sales wolves on the street, all with different ways of doing things, can create confusion to the marketplace and dilute the brand and the overall credibility of the company. The second reason is consistency of results. Every great sales process should create great results. Your sales process is like your game plan or your playbook. Once the players or the sales team understands the playbook, it should put your team in a winning position consistently. If it doesn't, then parts of your process need to be evaluated and adjusted. The third reason is really no one has arrived as the perfect salesperson. Nope, not even you, sorry. As a result, we know that everyone has room to improve and everyone deserves a good coach. When you have a clear sales process, you and your coach can better identify areas of improvement in your approach. When you think of elements of your sales process today, what do you think is working well? What do you think needs to be improved? Remember, there's a reason why you wet your hair before you shampoo it. There's a reason why you brush your teeth after you eat. And there's a reason why following a clear and effective sales process brings value to you and to your company. Essentially, just like most competitive sports, sales has a series of activities that takes place prior to the sales call, then the sales call, and then a series of activities that happen after the sales call. The elements of an effective sales process fall into one of these three categories. The first is the pre-sales activity, which falls into two subcategories, planning and preparation. In the planning phase, you perform activities such as prospect identification, product research, industry research, competitor research, and call strategy. In the preparation phase, you take the information you gleaned in the planning phase, put it into a written call plan, clear objectives and goals, create the appropriate presentation materials and/or tools, build the best stories, anticipate customer objections, and practice for the call. Yes, I said it, practice. The next stage is the customer engagement stage. This is where the planning and preparation get demonstrated at game time. Customer engagement requires a process within the process to maximize your results. Most sales processes have some form of in-call flow they recommend to the salespeople. The one I teach that has had incredible results for folks flows like this. Create connection, followed by identify and prioritize the issues, followed by create credibility, followed by solving the problem. You know this as the presentation portion, followed by handling any objections, and it ends with gaining commitment. In the next lesson, we'll help you get more details behind how to put this model to work in your sales process. Finally, in stage 3, post-sales activities, is where we close the loop on the process. In this stage, we do things like solution implementation, customer service and support, gather customer feedback, and get the feedback from our manager or coach on what went well and how we can improve the next call. Much like the pre-sale stage, we tend to overlook many aspects of the post-sale stage once we've gained the business. The reality is, this stage is critical to your long-term customer loyalty and results in significant increases in cross-selling opportunities. Research shows time and time again that it's infinitely easier to sell to a current happy customer than trying to bring on a brand new one. Treat your customers accordingly. These are the 3 stages and the elements contained within a good sales process. In the next lesson, you'll begin to build your own or modify the one you have for maximum impact. In previous lessons, we discussed the importance of a sales process and the elements of a good one. Now you get to take those elements and design a sales process that works for you. We will build this process around the 3 stages: pre-sales activities, customer engagement, and post-sales activities. As you build your pre-sales activity stage, it's important to be thinking about what knowledge and skills you need that will support your actual sales call and give you the highest likelihood of success. Make a list of things that you need to know about your prospect. Details like title, industry, current solution provider, maybe buying cycle, how did they engage with you, or did you cold call them, or maybe they contacted you in some other way. Next, test your own product knowledge. How well do you know the details of your solution and how it actually solves a problem? What do you still need to know? Who can you reach out to in your company in order to understand it better? How well do you know your competition? Make a list comparing and contrasting your solution with theirs. You should understand their products as well as you understand your own. Now, move into the preparation phase. Do you have a written call strategy? What are your objectives for the meeting? Are they measurable? What do you expect to happen after the meeting? What presentation materials do you need? What stories do you plan to leverage? Make a list of potential customer objections and create a story to combat each one should they arise. Lastly, once you've got all this information in a clear and easy to access plan, practice your call with a coach or peer. Then review it again on your own, visualizing the scenarios. Now you're ready for phase 2. As mentioned in a previous lesson, we have found the customer engagement stage works best when you follow a certain order. Step 1 is create connection. This goes beyond simply rapport building. It requires you to create an introduction story that shares who you are and why you do what you do. Step 2 is to identify and prioritize the issues the customer is facing. For more information, refer back to the previous lesson on understanding your customer's issues. Next up, we move into creating credibility. This is where you explain through a company story why you and your company are the most credible to solve the problem. From there, you solve the problem by presenting your solution. Think about creative ways to do this through stories and analogies and engaging visuals. Don't be boring and don't be a data dumper when presenting the solution. Use emotion and story-based techniques to maximize the customer's engagement. From there, you can address any objections the customer may have, but do so through narratives, not facts. Don't try to convince them that their objection is unfounded. Simply walk them through a story that shows them their fears are normal, but don't result in the worry that they currently have. Lastly, gain the commitment. Get them to decide the next step. Most people call it closing, but I teach folks not to close. If you follow the framework I just laid out, by the end, the customers should really close themselves. If they don't, you should reflect back on the steps and see where you might have missed an opportunity. Now you're on to building your last stage, post-sales activities. Make a list of steps that clearly outline for the customer the implementation steps. Simplify things as much as possible. Make it easy for the customer to change to your solution. Next, create a customer service contact and resolution process so that you and your customer know exactly what to do should they need help and exactly how each issue gets brought to resolution. Next, create a customer feedback questionnaire. It shouldn't be longer than 10 questions with a mix of ratings and open-ended comments. The last step in this stage is to create an evaluation sheet for yourself. Your manager likely already has one, but if they don't, create one and give it to your manager. Ask them to periodically go on sales calls with you and use the sheet to give you feedback afterwards. Similar to how athletes evaluate their performance on the field, the feedback from your manager is the game film we all need to review that makes us better each and every call. There you have it. You now have a complete framework for a great sales process. Once you apply the details for you and your business, you'll be in great shape to knock your sales goals out of the park.
近期有好多做導師嘅朋友喺度不停問我嘅 Brian 啊，而家呢個經濟咁差，冇生意，冇學生，咁做一個嘅教育事業應該點樣營運落去咧？佢話你係點樣做㗎啦？可唔可以俾啲 tips 俾大家啦？如果你係一個導師嘅時候，你係
To welcome all of you to Gaston Hall for this in the third of the Clinton Lectures at Georgetown. And I wish to thank all of you for being here and to offer a special word of welcome to our distinguished guests in attendance, including the Honorable Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, and Congressman John Delaney. We're honored to have you with us this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, President DeGioia, for having me back. Thank you, Father Hance, for agreeing to ask me questions. I'll give better answers than I did 50 years ago, I hope. Thank you all for coming, students, faculty, friends of Georgetown. Secretary Vilsack, thank you very much for being here and for your long career in public service. Congressman John Delaney, who is a shining hope for the possibility of bipartisan cooperation. He's got a bill to repatriate all this loose cash that's hanging around overseas that has as many Republican as Democratic sponsors, I think. Some people think there's something wrong with that. I think that's a pretty good idea, so I thank him for that. I want to thank my classmates and friends who are here and get the show on the road. 2 years ago, I came here in April, intending to give a series of 3 or 4 lectures on composing a life in public service, whether that's in elected or appointed office or in the private sector or working for a non-governmental organization. In the first talk, I said there are 4 essential elements to any successful service: a focus on people, policy, politics, and purpose. In that first lecture, I was primarily focused on the importance of people-centered service, on the necessity of understanding how different people view themselves and the world they're living in. Without understanding people, it's pretty hard to develop the best policies and to build and maintain support for them. As I said then, I grew up in a storytelling culture. So I told you stories about people who taught me that everybody has a story and kept me focused on how to help other people have better stories. I told you stories about my family and my teachers beginning in junior high and running through Georgetown, about people I'd worked with over the years, and people I'd met who were dealing with their own life struggles. The second lecture covered policymaking and the compromises that are almost always involved when trying to do what Machiavelli called the most difficult thing in all of human affairs: to change the established order of things. We discussed how policymaking was done when I was president in developing the economic plan in 1993, which reversed 12 years of trickle-down economics and gave us the only period in 50 years when all sectors of the American economy grew robustly and the bottom 20%'s income rose 23.6%, the same as the top 5%. We talked about crafting the Welfare Reform Bill of 1996, what compromises were acceptable, what wasn't, what's worked over the long run, what still needs to be changed. And we talked about the pursuit of peace in the Middle East. I hope that talk convinced you that policy actually matters, that ideas, when implemented, have consequences, and different ideas have different consequences. A great deal of political rhetoric is devoted to blurring that, to pretending that if something good happens and the other guy did it, it was an accident, and if something bad happens and you did it, well, it couldn't have been because you pursued the wrong policy. And because so much of our voting habits today are determined by the culture in which we live and the conditions in which we experience the world, we tend to blur all that. So I hope I convinced you that whenever you're trying to evaluate policy, you should try to ask yourself, is there a difference between the story and the storyline? Always look for the story. Sometimes it's in the storyline, and sometimes it's not. There is a difference between the headlines and the trend lines. Typically, for perfectly understandable reasons, bad news makes better news than good news. But sometimes the trend lines are much better than the headlines. So we may have occasion to revisit that. Today, I want to talk about the purpose of public service, driven by a concern for people, manifest in policies one is advocating, and about the politics of turning concern and good policy into real changes that fulfill your purpose. For obvious reasons, I don't intend to talk much about electoral politics. But it's important to remember, as the Secretary Vilsack and Congressman Delaney can tell you, there is plenty of politics when the election is over in trying to implement policy. And there's plenty of politics if you're not in elected office, if you're working in a private business or you're working for an NGO. That's the kind of politics I want to talk about. How do you have the skills to actually turn your ideas into action? In every public service success, leadership requires a vision of a better future where the purpose of public service is made plain in the circumstances of the moment. A clear, understandable plan to realize that vision and the ability to actually implement the changes, if at all possible, by the inclusion of all the stakeholders in the process. This is becoming more important than ever before. In an interdependent world, whether we like it or not, inclusive politics is necessary to have inclusive economics. Inclusive discussion with various stakeholders is necessary to effect positive social change. Asia has three interesting, very vigorous leaders at the moment. And the president of China, President Xi, who's trying to grow the Chinese economy internally more by resuming population growth by modifying the one-child policy and trying to eliminate some of the corruption that has been endemic to the system. And Prime Minister Abe of Japan, who is trying to overcome his own country's reluctance to alter their culture by allowing widespread immigration, by putting more women into the workforce and enabling people to work longer. And Prime Minister Modi of India, who has written a book called Inclusive Politics, Inclusive Governance, and who recognizes that his country's big problem is it has grown like crazy for the last 20 years in and around its tech prosperity centers, but only 35% of the people are being reached by that effort. And that India needs to develop the ability to aggregate and deploy capital so that 100% of the people of India can have a chance to benefit from the enterprise that is now driving dramatic prosperity for just 35% of them. So this inclusion issue is going to become bigger and bigger and bigger in the lifetime of the students who are here. But let me try to illustrate the success of leadership and the pitfalls with a few recent examples. Recent in my terms, not the students' terms. Helmut Kohl was the Chancellor of Germany when the Berlin Wall came down. He had a vision born of a lifetime of experience that included, obviously, living through World War II, of a united, peaceful, and prosperous Germany in a united, democratic, peaceful Europe. Both these developments may seem normal to you. They were virtually unimaginable for most of European history, in which Germany was not a separate country, but a collection of city-states, and then united under Bismarck. Kohl became the second longest serving chancellor in German history in the pursuit of his vision, second only to Bismarck. And he had a strategy which he pursued with extraordinary discipline. It was first to unite Germany after the wall came down, which required very large transfers of money from West Germany to East Germany to begin the long process of equalizing the economic opportunities on both sides of the former divide. Second, to expand and strengthen the European Union. He wanted all of Central and Eastern Europe to come into the EU so that Germany would be in the middle of Europe, not on the edge where it had been a source of instability and conflict throughout the 20th century. Third, he wanted to expand NATO and strengthen the transatlantic ties with the United States because he thought that was important to building a prosperous democratic future for Germans and for the rest of Europe. And fourth, often forgotten, he became the most vigorous supporter of Russia after the end of communism, its economic recovery, its democracy building, and its increasing cooperation with the EU and the US. It's hard to believe given today's headlines, but that was the order we were all trying to build in the 1990s, and it worked for quite a while. In the beginning, it worked very well, but there were two central problems with implementing Kohl's vision after he left office. One is that much of the European Union, although not every member, adopted the euro as a currency. They had a eurozone currency, which was adopted before those in the eurozone had a common economic policy, a common social policy, and a common public investment policy, which meant it worked great when Europe was growing well, and Greeks could borrow money at German interest rates, essentially. But when the economy turned down, it no longer worked very well, partly because the German voters didn't understand how much gain they had gotten out of all those good years when Greece and Spain and Portugal and Italy got to borrow money at common interest rates and buy German exports. And Germany is, by the way, still the #1 rich country in the world in the percentage of its GDP tied to exports and tied to manufacturing. In no small measure, but a good lesson for the United States because of its dramatic success in involving small and middle-sized businesses in the export market, having a continuous lifetime training program, and having a program that pays employers to keep people working instead of paying unemployed employees unemployment benefits. So it worked fine. But when Greece failed, and Ireland failed, and Spain had skyrocketing unemployment, all for slightly different reasons, although basically it was just a real estate boom going bust in Ireland and Spain, and Portugal and Italy had their own troubles, the automatic response of the EU was to try to impose austerity on Greece because they had governments that had for years made promises to people they couldn't keep, and because they had a country in which rich people didn't pay taxes. In fact, constitutionally, the shipping companies are exempted from taxes, something a lot of people don't know. So that if you were a cab driver in Athens or a fisherman in the Aegean, you felt like a chump if you did pay your taxes. But Greece began a program of austerity in 2009. When they started, their public debt was 120% of GDP. Today, they made all these payments and their public debt's about 180% of GDP, which means that the fundamental laws of economics have not been repealed. If inflation is lower than interest rates, there's insufficient demand, and more austerity will get you in a deeper hole, not get you out of it. So that happened. And there was no provision made at the creation of the Eurozone for how to get out without collapsing the hole or without spooking the markets. And that was probably an error. If they weren't prepared to have common economic and social policy and some sort of investment, they should have made an exit strategy part of the beginning. Then the market hazards wouldn't have been so great. The typical thing for a little country in the kind of trouble that Greece is to devalue, take all the hard medicine, and start growing again. That's what Iceland did, which is not in the Eurozone. And Iceland was a particular tragedy. Its banks were far more leveraged than American banks, but they also had more self-made millionaires, mostly in tech and retail businesses, than any other, as a percentage of their population, than any other European country. So they devalued and started building again and got out of this mess they were in a hurry. So that doesn't mean that Kohl's European idea was wrong. It doesn't, and the EU and the strengthening of it, and for many older Europeans, even the boring and bureaucratic nature of the cumbersome machinery in Brussels of the EU is a godsend, far better than uncertainty and war and endless intrigue with destructive consequences. The other thing that happened to Kohl's vision, of course, is that Russia took a more unilateral and authoritarian turn, as manifest most vividly in what happened in Ukraine and what continues to happen there. But on balance, you would have to say he was the most important European leader since World War II because of the good things that happened and the bad things that didn't happen. And I still believe, over the long run, we will return to the path that he advocated for so long. Second example, Lee Kuan Yew, the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, recently passed away at 91. And I was asked, along with Henry Kissinger and Tom Donilon, to represent the United States at his funeral, because I had known him and had a lot of contact with him, and so I went. When Lee took office more than 50 years ago in 1962, He was the leader of a small city-state of a few million people with a per capita income of under $1,000 a year. It had recently broken off from Malaysia. And there was a lot of uncertainty about two things. One was whether this little city-state that was heavily majority Chinese with a big Malay minority and a smaller but still noticeable Indian minority, and then Filipinos and others in this diverse state, could ever make a go of it. And two, whether a state that small could withstand the debilitating consequences of the corruption which was then endemic to most of the Asian rising countries. Lee had a strategy. He wanted first his vision was to have a prosperous, unified, secure nation. And he knew that Singapore had the most important thing of all at the time he came of age, location. It was located at a critical juncture for all the major sea lanes in Asia. He knew the Asian economy was going to boom, and he wanted to be there. So his strategy was, first, to govern Singapore on terms of equal treatment for all its citizens without regard to their ethnic background. There were 10 speakers at his funeral. His son, the prime minister, spoke first about his leadership. His second son, spoke last about what a good father he was. In the middle, there were representatives of every ethnic group in Singapore who talked about how he had made a home for them. Inclusion. He also was so rigorous in the pursuit of corruption, from cabinet ministers to minor functionaries overcharging people for fines, that he allowed people who were part of his own political movement to go to prison. But he got rid of corruption, and Singapore soon gained a reputation as a place to invest, a place where people wanted to be, where everything was on the up and up, things were on the level. It made a huge difference. The third thing he wanted to do was to have an alliance with the United States for security purposes, but to get along with everybody in the neighborhood, which he proceeded to do. And finally, he launched a constant, organized effort to modernize the country, educationally, economically, technologically, and to maintain social cohesion, with methods that most of us in the United States often thought were pretty severe, including caning maldoers. But it worked. I remember once there was a lot of joking in the press about the fact that Singapore banned chewing gum. They got mad because kids were leaving chewing gum under desks and under seats on public transportation and things like that. But they got rid of the problem. And they built, by common consensus, one of the 5 best education systems in the world. A few years ago, a small country with only 6+ million people allocated $3 billion to biotechnology research, the same amount of your money I spent to sequence the human genome. So, did it succeed? Well, when he took office, the per capita income was under $1,000. When we celebrated his life at his memorial service, Singapore's per capita income was $55,000. One of the most remarkable economic success stories ever. Ernesto Zedillo became sort of an accidental president of Mexico. The person his party favored for the presidency was killed early in the campaign season, and he was picked to succeed him. But he was a very well-trained economist, and he wanted to build a modern economy for Mexico and a modern political nation. That was his vision. So he set about building a modern economy by opening Mexico to competition and investment and promoting responsible, more honest behavior. Early in this effort, through no fault of his own, they had a horrible economic crisis. They were about to go broke, and the United States stepped in. I was president, it was 20 years ago. We stepped in and gave him a loan, which on the day I gave it was opposed by something like 80% of the American people who thought about Mexico's yesterdays instead of its tomorrows. Zedillo repaid that loan to the United States 3 years early with more than $500 million in interest. It was one of the best investments we ever made. We still have disagreements with Mexico, but think about your own life. It's one thing to have a disagreement with a friend, and another to have a disagreement with an adversary. And the consequences are dramatically different. Maybe more important, he recognized that his country could never become fully modern unless it was more politically competitive. And his party, the PRI, had enjoyed a monopoly on power for 70 years. He opened the field of competition, had an honest election. It was won by Vicente Fox, and he handed over power peacefully for the first time in 7 decades to a member of the opposite party. Did it work? Well, Mexico is not free of problems, but it's worth noting that one of his successors built 140 tuition-free universities, and last year they graduated more than 100,000 engineers, and that the economic growth was sufficient to keep Mexicans home. Between 2010 and 2014, for the first time in my lifetime, there was no net in-migration from Mexico. Nelson Mandela's vision was to build a modern democratic state that would survive and thrive after the end of apartheid and the end of his term. His strategy included his now famous Reconciliation Commission where people who had committed crimes, even murderous crimes during the apartheid era, could come and testify, make their actions a part of the public record, and then be reconciled to the rest of the country so they could participate in the future. It was an astonishing thing. He said, well, you know, we don't have time to build any more jails and worry about this. We got to go forward. Something that was copied largely in a slightly different form through local community courts by Rwanda after the Rwanda genocide, and a capacity that is beyond the culture of many other countries. Interestingly enough, we are now seeing the ongoing efforts of the president of Colombia, President Santos, to resolve the last remaining conflicts there with the FARC. And the big hang-up is who's going to be held responsible for what. And this is something we all have to deal with in our lives, and we have to deal with in other cultures, but accountability is important, but so is going beyond. And different people, different cultures draw the balance in different ways. There's no doubt in my mind that Mandela did the right thing for South Africa. The second thing he did, which was arguably just as important, was practice the politics of radical inclusion. That, to most of us, was symbolized when he invited his jailers to his inauguration. But far more important was that he put the leaders of the parties that supported apartheid in his cabinet. You think, well, that happens all the time in national unity governments. Mandela ran for president with 18 opponents and got 63% of the vote. And the first time black South Africans had voted in 300 years. And his whole term occurred when I was president. So we did a lot of business together. And I always let him call me late at night because of the time difference. He liked to go to bed early and he knew I'd stay up late, and so he'd call me late at night. So he called me one night and he said, "Oh, they're giving me hell." And I said, "Who, the Boers?" I was always kidding him about the Afrikaners and their whole history and everything. He said, "Oh, no, my own people." I said, "Well, what are they saying?" They're saying, "How can you put these people in the government? You won 63% of the vote. They kept you in prison, and while you were in prison, they were beating us up, shooting us, killing a bunch of us. Now you're going to give them government ministries?" And I said, "What did you tell them?" He said, I said, "Well, you know, we just voted for the first time in 300 years. So let me ask you, can we run the financial system all by ourselves? Can we run the military all by ourselves? Can we run the police all by ourselves? Is there one thing in this whole country we can run all by ourselves?" The answer is no. Maybe someday. This is not that day. He said, "If I can get over it, so can you. We're going to do this together." You'd be surprised somebody gave a speech like that in Washington, wouldn't you? It's important to recognize that, not to be too sanctimonious here, Mandela had paid a remarkable price and learned astonishing lessons. And he had the stature to do that and not fall. There was a third, now often overlooked part of his strategy, which was wide, that hasn't worked out yet. He named as his deputy president a much younger man, Thabo Mbeki, who was the most gifted economist in South Africa. Because he knew it would take his entire term, and he was determined only to serve one term. He was already well into his 70s, and he paid a pretty stiff physical price for the first years of his imprisonment. So the other part of his strategy was to be succeeded by Mbeki so he could build a modern economic state and increase trade and investment across Africa in a way that would stabilize South Africa. That part of the plan didn't work for reasons beyond his control. South Africa first became the epicenter of the world's AIDS crisis and was made worse by the troubles in Zimbabwe and other places, which led to even more people coming into South Africa who were HIV positive. Meanwhile, and still to me somewhat mystifying, Mbeki denied for a long time the nature, the dimensions, the cause, and the remedies of the crisis. I knew this because our foundation helped them to come up with an AIDS plan, and they were doing fine in the cities. They had prosperous cities and great health systems, but they really had to get out into the countryside. And when we celebrated Mandela, I can't remember, maybe his 80th birthday, his 80th or his 85th birthday, I was down there, and we had 50 people who worked with our Health Access Initiative, dressed up and ready to go to South Africa to implement a plan that the government, the cabinet had adopted. And it all was canceled. And it was a bizarre story of local politics gone awry. The third most important person in South Africa's political hierarchy, after the president and the deputy president, is the treasurer of the African National Congress, because he funds all their political operations, and it was effectively a one-party dominant state. His wife was a health minister. She had been trained as a physician in the old Soviet Union, and she thought AIDS was sort of a Western plot to make pharmaceutical companies more money, and said all this could be cured by eating native roots and yams. Sounds crazy now, but they believe that. And Mbeki felt, perhaps accurately, that he couldn't let her go and hold on to power. So even though he had a wonderful woman working for him in his office who wanted to do something about it, they didn't. But the point is, it's another thing to remember, whatever you do. Mbeki took office intending to build a modern economic state. He was gifted enough to do it. He knew enough to do it. But he didn't deal well with the incoming fire. When something happens you didn't intend to happen, AIDS explodes. You can't play like it didn't happen. I always say, when President Bush and Al Gore ran for president in 2000, nobody asked either one of them, what are you going to do? When the Twin Towers were blown up, the Pentagon's attacked, and another plane named for the Capitol crashes in Pennsylvania. He could have said, I'm sorry, that's not what I ran to do. I ran to reverse Bill Clinton's economic policy. I'm sorry, I can't do that. You're laughing, but you see, don't you? I mean, that's basically what happened in South Africa. And that's important to remember, not just in politics, but in anything. There's always going to be something happen you weren't planning for. And you have to learn to deal with that and pursue your original vision at the same time. But Mandela still deserves history's applause because South Africa is still a democracy, it's still operating, it's still doing a lot of good. President Zuma, who has his own problems, has been great dealing with AIDS, really great. And Mandela proved that inclusion is better than constant conflict. So I think all of that works. Now let's talk about some non-state actors. Wangari Maathai, who died a couple years ago, won the Nobel Prize in 2004 for creating the Greenbelt movement in Kenya. She was a good friend of Hillary's and mine, and she was an amazing woman. But she knew that the Kenyan tree cover had gone all the way down to 1% of the land, that it was eroding the topsoil, destroying agricultural productivity, that it was going to cause endless political conflicts in the country, fuel corruption. And she had a vision of repairing that damage so that Kenya could take its considerable other strengths and grow in a way that pursues broad-based prosperity. But what she won the Nobel Prize for was figuring out, I need to figure out something everybody can do to advance this vision. And I don't need to just be in the parliament, advocate these changes. I need to do something that will involve everyone. And so she got thousands and thousands and thousands of people to plant trees, tens of millions of trees. Single-handedly from the grassroots up, she began to try to reverse a debilitating trend without which, that we're still working on today. So her vision as a citizen organizing an NGO, she didn't have the power to do it all herself. But now the government has supported policies finally that are allowing us to map the country, to plan in a strategic way, to do things. And they asked my foundation to go there because of, I think, our long friendship with her and what we've done. But that's a way to look at her life and say, she made a real difference. And she did it by empowering individual people to do something that sounds simple and doing it on a scale that would catch the attention of the world. I'll give you another example. A Republican American businessman, now sadly passed away a few years ago. In the early 1960s, Ken Iverson founded a company called Nucor. It was a steel company. His vision was to make steel not in original casting, the way it was largely done in and around Pittsburgh, but by melting down existing steel and then reforming it. And the technology was developed so the steel could then be rolled in 1-inch thick rolls instead of 4-inch thick rolls, making it much more malleable, much more suitable for conversion into a variety of purposes. That's not the important thing. Iverson decided that if he wanted his company to last for the long run and to be able to adapt, that 40% of their success would be rooted in their technology and 60% in their people. So he adopted the most radical egalitarian culture of any company of which I'm aware in America. And like I said, and the reason I know this is I recruited a company to Arkansas, and I liked him, and I'm pretty sure he never voted for me because he was a really conservative Republican. He didn't want the government to tell him to do this, but this was a communitarian's dream, what he did. First of all, when he had 11 steel mills in America, they had no corporate headquarters. They rented office space in an office park in Charlotte, North Carolina. They had a grand total of 22 people in the central office with 11 steel mills. The workers were paid a salary that averaged 65 to 75% of the industry average, but they got a weekly bonus based on production totals. And the non-production workers got a bonus based on another formula. In addition to that, there was a profit-sharing plan of 10% of the profits unavailable to top management. Everybody else participated. In addition to that, if you had a child who wanted to go to college and you were a Nucor employee, they would pay the equivalent of a year's tuition in community college for the child to go. One man in Darlington, South Carolina, educated 8 children working for Nucor, and it had no adverse effect on your pay or your bonus. In addition to that, they had a no layoff policy. So I've still got the letter Ken Iverson wrote to all his employees in the only year in the 1980s when Nucor made less money than they did the year before. They never lost money until the financial crash, but their profit margin went down. So he sent a letter which said something like this. As you know, the world steel business is in a terrible slump, and so our sales went down 20% this year. This is not your fault. You did everything I asked you to do. It is, however, my fault. I should have been smart enough to figure out how we could be the only company in the world not to have our profits decline. As you know, I have a no layoff policy, so everybody's income is going down 20% this year. But since it's my fault, not yours, I'm going to cut my income 60%. And there was a big article in Fortune or Forbes. It was kind of mixed tone, pointing out how he was now, by a light years, the lowest paid Fortune 500 company executive in America. He wore it like a badge of honor. When I was president, he wrote a little management book called Plain Talk. It's still my favorite one. He said, I can go down the street in New York, where all these corporate offices are, and I can watch people go to work and look at them 5 minutes at their desk and tell you whether that company's succeeding or not. And he said, long before it became the problem it is today, I don't want short-term investors in Nucor. They want somebody committed to turn a quick profit. They should invest somewhere else. We're in it for the long run. And it's very interesting to see he had a very inclusive process. There were only 3 management layers below him and the employee making the steel. And every employee had the president's phone number and his. And you could call him on the phone, but only if you had talked to your supervisor first. The point is, he created a culture of radical inclusion. And it worked, and it's working today. They have the same culture today, except now, and the education benefit is higher. And if you've got a spouse who wants to go to college, your spouse is eligible. And if you want to go after work, you can go. And none of it takes a penny away from either your wages or your bonus. So,
Yeah.
well, interestingly enough, they weren't the ones that were most politically unpopular. Like I said, 80% of the people were against what I did in Mexico, easy decision. 74% of the people were against my first act in the international arena as president, which was to put together a big aid package for Russia, because they were then so poor in '93 they couldn't even afford to bring their soldiers home from the Baltic states. A majority was against what I did in Bosnia when we started. The most difficult decision were my version of impacting the AIDS crisis. First, I ran for president because I thought trickle-down economics was wrong. We had a robust economic climate for most of the 1980s, and ordinary people weren't benefiting from it at all. Poverty had gone up, wages were stagnant, and I wanted to give the middle class a tax cut, and right before I was elected, the government said, oh, by the way, the deficit's going to be twice as big as we told you it was. Oh, by the way. So I had 2 choices. I could play like it didn't happen and just go ahead and present my original plan, or go back to the core strategy, which was to get America growing again, we had to bring interest rates down, because keep in mind, we had a normal economy, that is inflation. Interest rates were getting high, and it was going to drive, and they were higher than inflation. So my gamble was if I could get interest rates down, there'd be this huge amount of private investment which would overcome the contractionary impact of the economic plan I presented, which called for both spending cuts and tax increases. But I hated to give up something that I really wanted to provide, and I had to choose that or doubling the earned income tax credit, which benefited primarily lower income workers who had children. And I just don't think a society as rich as ours should allow anybody to have kids in the house and work full time and still be in poverty. I just think that's wrong. So I did it, but it wasn't. And so all I heard for 2 years ago, he broke his promise on the middle class tax cut. The interest rate declines were worth $2,200 to the average family in lower mortgage rates, college loan rates, home mortgage rates, and credit card rates. And when we passed the balanced budget bill, we also passed the middle class tax cut. But that was a hard decision. It was hard for me not to act alone in Bosnia. We all knew what Serbia was doing in Bosnia. And I sent my then Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, around to Europe and asked them to help, and they didn't want to do it, and there's 1,000 reasons why. And I decided I shouldn't do that because it wouldn't be sustainable. But, the Europeans had to buy in. They had to own the fact that if they wanted a Europe that was united, democratic, and free for the first time in history, the Balkans were going to be part of it. And so I waited until we could get a unified response. But it was a painful wait. A lot of people died on that wait. And some of the decisions that I regret most were not hard, but were wrong. Like we didn't even talk seriously about whether we should send troops to Rwanda, because the public was exhausted with what happened at Black Hawk Down and in Somalia, and because we were involved in Bosnia, and that was much more in the news, and frankly, we didn't have any idea they could kill 10% of the country in 90 days with machetes, essentially. So sometimes the things you regret most were not hard at the time. They should have been a little harder. I'll always regret we didn't have a long, drawn-out debate on it. We didn't even really discuss it. And I've spent my life trying to make it up to the Rwandans, and I'm about to get there, I think. And I'm working at it.
This is a question I wanted to ask. Early on, you committed yourself to public service, and you outlined your fundamental purpose. A vocational commitment like that, did you ever go through a time when you really question it and say, what am I doing here? And tempted to withdraw?
You mean just to give it up?
Public service.
Well, I did a couple times when I was governor. I was governor a long time.
Okay.
At least I proved I could hold down a job. But I served a very long time, and the people of my native state were good enough to elect me 5 times. Based on recent events, I don't know if I can win again down there. So there were times when I just got burned out, But I never wanted, I'd always find something new to do. And I told people one reason I love being in public life, it was like peeling an onion that had no end. There was always another layer. It was always something new, always something interesting. There was always something to engage the imagination and to stretch your capacities. So I didn't. And when the Congress and the press and all were all hot on that whitewater business, and I realized I knew it wasn't on the level, there was nothing to it. And that there couldn't have been. I invested in a land deal and lost money. The guy later went into the S&L business. It failed. It was the smallest S&L failure in the country, and I didn't ever borrow any money from him. It was a made-up deal. It was heartbreaking to me to see otherwise sensible people treated like it was something, but it never made me want to quit. I was raised, I had an unusual upbringing, but I was raised not to quit. We're not big on quitting in my family. You may have noticed that. So it was awful, but I learned to kind of just wall it off. And I think, I also felt maybe this was arrogant, and I shouldn't have felt that way. But I spent a lot of time when I was president reading the history of other presidencies, including not well-known presidents. And I realized that the success of a given president it's first determined by the time in which you live. I mean, watch it as though you're going to be a great president or a flop, depending on whether you try to be a king or he gave us a democracy. He made the right decision. Therefore, even though government had nowhere near the range of things to do that it does now, he was a very great president. And he made really good decisions on the big things. Lincoln became president when the whole question was whether the Union would survive or not. A lot of people thought it wouldn't. A lot of people thought the South had more talented generals and that we wouldn't hang around. The Union wouldn't hang around long enough to do it. And Roosevelt had the Depression in World War II. But it also depends on whether the skills and the psychology of a person in a given leadership position, this is not just politics, actually fit well with the challenges of that particular moment. And when I read all these histories of the lesser-known presidents, I realized some of them were really well-suited to govern when they did, and others might have been quite successful had they governed at another time, but not then. Like I'll just give you an example. A lot of people think Franklin Pierce is one of the worst presidents we ever had. And if you measure that because he was elected right before the Civil War and he couldn't stop the country's drift toward war and he couldn't figure out how to stop the spread of slavery and he couldn't do this and couldn't do that, that's absolutely true. But he was an immensely successful soldier in the Mexican War. He was a successful member of Congress and went home and became governor of New Hampshire, only other governor of a small state to be elected president. And he was on his way to be inaugurated with his only child. Presidents were then inaugurated in March, and he took a train from New Hampshire down to Washington. On the way, there was a train wreck. Nobody was hurt very bad. There were a couple broken bones, except his 11-year-old son, who fell on his neck, snapped it, and died. Nobody else got more than a little broken bone. And that's how he began his presidency, with his wife in a virtually catatonic state of grief. So I always wondered whether, had he had different circumstances, he might have been quite a successful president. Ruled in a calmer time, and I'm not sure that it was in the cards for anybody to succeed before the country split apart. So anyway, that's what I think about. But I don't, by and large, I think when you get tired, you want to bag it. Unless you're old and you think, I've got 3 years left and I'd like to spend it doing something else, you ought to hang in there and work through it. Or if you believe you made the right decision in the first place, and you ought to go, somebody will push you out one way or the other. But you ought not to open the door if you think if your vision has not been fulfilled. I'm not big on quitting. I'd rather hang around. around and fight it through. And if you need to go, somebody will kick you out.
All right, Mr. President, we're allowed one more question. You've obviously read very widely over a long time. If you had to recommend one book, what would it be?
One book?
That's all you get. You mentioned one earlier, but
The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius.